When General Wilhelm Keitel stepped toward the gallows in autumn 1946, silence fell like judgment itself. No more ranks, no medals, just a man facing the verdict of history. But amidst that silence, a few words echoed and left everyone attending speechless. Wilhelm Keitel's last words will chill you to the bone, but they'll also make you question everything about loyalty. What he said wasn't just shocking. It revealed something darker than the crimes themselves. Why? Because they exposed the one thing every soldier fears. What he said in those final seconds would divide historians for decades. Here's why. Echoes before the drop. October 16th, 1946. The trapdoor waited. Wilhelm Boden Johann Gustav Keitel stepped forward. Zero emotion. Zero fear. The guards exchanged glances. This wasn't normal. Witnesses described a rigid composure, the same obedience that had defined him during war, now guiding him toward death. His execution at Nuremberg was one of the most symbolic acts of justice in modern history. Yet the quiet preceding it felt stranger than the verdict itself. He had been condemned for crimes beyond counting. But that morning, there was no chaos, no pleas, no outburst. Instead, Keitel moved as though continuing a military ceremony, saluting his own fate. Those who expected remorse found precision, and those who listened were about to hear words that would chill them to the bone, shocked them much more than the execution itself. As his hands were bound, the U.S. Army chaplain confirmed his identity. The guard detail later noted that Keitel answered firmly, "Yes." That simple affirmation carried the same mechanical assurance he'd used when acknowledging Hitler's directives years earlier, but his eyes told a different story, one that the guards would report in classified documents years later. Allied observers scribbled notes, detached, mechanical. One wrote, "It's like he's already dead inside." For them, it was eerie. This wasn't a man broken by defeat. It was a man who, even in disgrace, believed he represented order itself. And that's precisely why his last words struck such a nerve, because when they came, they didn't sound like surrender. They sounded like doctrine. The world expected confession, but Keitel delivered conviction. That contrast between expectation and delivery is what gives his final words their enduring chill. It's why historians still debate what he meant and whether he ever accepted guilt at all. Because stepping on that trapdoor that day was a man who thought he didn't deserve his fate. Not because he thought his side deserved to win the war, but because despite all he had done, despite all he had seen, he still believed that he had done nothing wrong. The role he could not escape. Wilhelm Keitel wasn't born to lead an empire of death. He was shaped into it. A career officer from the old Prussian army, he rose through ranks built on discipline, hierarchy, and unquestioning obedience. When Hitler came to power, Keitel's loyalty, not brilliance, became his greatest asset. In 1938, after the purge of independent-minded generals, Hitler created the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the armed forces, and placed Keitel at its head. From that moment, every military order, every invasion, every crime that required a signature passed through his hands. He wasn't the architect of Nazi policy. He was its instrument, polished to perfection, and that in the end made him indispensable and doomed. Every order Hitler wanted executed, it went through Keitel's desk. Every atrocity that needed legal authorization, Keitel signed it. The paper trail alone could hang him, but one document in particular sealed his fate, and he knew it the moment they showed it to him. The prosecutor opened the file. "Did you sign this?" Keitel's face didn't change. Yes. Did you know it was illegal? Pause. Yes. He confessed that the Commissar order, which called for the immediate execution of Soviet political officers, had passed through his hands. He signed it anyway. To the tribunal, that signature became a symbol, proof that obedience without conscience can destroy nations. Wilhelm Keitel's last words would later reference this exact moment, the moment he chose loyalty over law. But to Keitel, obedience was conscience. A soldier cannot disobey, he told the court, invoking the idea that loyalty to command outweighed every personal judgment. His defense echoed through the chamber like a drilled formation call, precise, unbending, and empty of remorse. You can sense the dilemma forming. If a man builds his entire identity around submission to authority, what happens when that authority is found criminal? The man himself collapses under the logic of his own faith, and that collapse played out document by document. Witnesses noted that Keitel often appeared weary, but never uncertain. During testimony, he referred to Hitler with mechanical respect, still calling him the Führer. Even in defeat, he used the language of service. The prosecutors pressed him. Did he ever question the legality of what he ordered? Keitel's reply was chillingly simple. I obeyed. 2 words. That's all it took to prove guilt. To the Allied judges, that phrase wasn't a defense. It was the evidence. It revealed a mind so disciplined by command structure that it could no longer distinguish moral choice. One British correspondent later wrote, "He seemed to confuse obedience with honor, as if the two were interchangeable." That confusion would define his final words, because when he faced death, he didn't speak as an individual pleading for mercy. He spoke as a soldier still bound to the institution that had already fallen, a general who still believed he'd done nothing wrong. But the prosecution was about to prove just how much pain and suffering had passed through his hands. And this time, no defense would save him. The criminal orders and the weight of guilt. The prosecutor slammed the first document on the table, then another, then another. Each one was signed by Wilhelm Keitel. Each one was a death warrant. Commissar order signed. Night and fog decree signed. Commando order signed. The pattern was undeniable. And Keitel sat there, stone-faced as his own handwriting condemned him. These documents would haunt Wilhelm Keitel's last words because he never denied signing them. Among the most damning was the Commissar order issued in 1941. It demanded the captured Soviet political officers be executed on the spot. No trial, no prisoner of war rights. When asked if he'd questioned it, Keitel didn't deny his approval. I transmitted it as instructed, he admitted. Those 6 words sealed his reputation. Then came the Night and Fog Decree, authorizing the secret disappearance of civilians suspected of resistance activity. Victims vanished without record. Families never learned their fate. In court, Keitel acknowledged signing that too. The logic was military. The effect was terror. The commando order followed, instructing that Allied special forces captured behind German lines be killed immediately, even if they surrendered. That document bore Keitel's name in unmistakable ink. The prosecution read it aloud, noting that no appeal to humanity remained within it. And there was more. Orders involving forced labor, scorched earth tactics, cooperation with the SS and Einsatzgruppe group all passed through his hands. Each time Keitel's defense was the same, duty, not intent. I was not the originator, he said. I only conveyed. But the tribunal saw through the phrasing. Without your countersignature, one prosecutor stated, these orders might never have become law. It was a simple argument. Responsibility travels with authority. For the judges, the picture was clear. Keitel had operationalized criminal policy. He had taken what might have remained an ideological fantasy and turned it into a command structure. His guilt was not in conception, but in execution, and in that nuance lay the moral horror. Each signed order pushed his defense further into contradiction. How could a man insist he was powerless while exercising absolute administrative control? That paradox became the heart of his downfall. But the most damning evidence wasn't in the files. It was about to come from his own mouth. The defense that crumbled in the dock, November 1945. The courtroom is packed. Wilhelm Keitel stands. Every eye is on him. Every reporter is ready. He opens his mouth and delivers the worst defense in Nuremberg history. For weeks, the Allied prosecutors had laid out document after document, evidence so vast that guilt seemed beyond question. Yet Keitel still stood with the confidence of a man reciting regulations, not seeking mercy. His defense was built on one word: obedience. He told the tribunal, "I have acted under orders, and to obey was my duty as a soldier." It was the same principle that had guided every signature, every command, every denial of conscience. But inside that chamber, that logic collided with a higher law. The judges were not asking if he followed orders. They were asking whether those orders were crimes against humanity and whether he had a choice. As the prosecutors pressed, Keitel's answers revealed the limits of his reasoning. When asked whether he'd ever considered refusing an unlawful command, he replied, "Such a concept did not exist for me." The phrase hung in the air, like a confession disguised as a justification. The judges leaned forward. Did he just admit he never questioned a single order? British prosecutor Sir David Maxwell Fee read aloud the sequence of orders bearing Keitel's signature. He ended with a cold observation. "These are not the acts of a subordinate. These are the acts of a man who wielded the pen of policy." Keitel listened motionless. When he finally spoke, it was to defend the very system that now condemned him. "I believed I was serving Germany," he said. "Stop. Think about that." The line summed up the tragedy, a belief so absolute, it blurred all boundaries. Throughout the trial, his demeanor never shifted. He stood rigid, clicked his heels, addressed the tribunal as "Your Honors," and referred to himself in the third person when answering for his actions. To those watching, it was unsettling. A man trying to preserve military decorum while his entire worldview disintegrated. By the final day, even Keitel seemed to sense the futility. He told the court, "I recognize that the verdict will be severe. I accept it as fate, but that acceptance didn't mean repentance. It was resignation, the discipline of a man too conditioned to rebel, even against death." And that's what gave his final words their strange, enduring chill. They weren't born from fear, but from the same fatal loyalty that had defined his life. He told the court he acknowledged responsibility, but responsibility without remorse is just documentation. And at the scaffold, that distinction would become crystal clear. Because Wilhelm Keitel's last words weren't an apology, they were a declaration, the final statement. Guilty. The word hung in the air. Wilhelm Keitel stood for his final statement. No tears, no begging, just precision. What he was about to say would reveal a mind that never broke, not even when facing death. His opening words were simple. "I have loved my country, and I have done my duty as I understood it." To the tribunal, that sounded less like defense than repetition. Keitel wasn't fighting for his life. He was trying to define how history would remember him. He claimed that he had told the truth throughout the trial, that he had concealed nothing, and that his conscience was clear. He admitted that he bore responsibility in the military sense, but stopped short of moral confession. It was as if he could separate his duty from his humanity. And in his mind, he could, after all. He hadn't been the one to come up with such horrendous orders for the Nazi soldiers to execute. He hadn't written them down with his own hands. He had just signed on them, like any other obedient general would have done when receiving orders from the Führer. Observers described the moment as eerily calm. No emotion, no trembling hands, just the cadence of a man still reporting to superiors. The prosecutors' faces were expressionless. They'd heard every form of justification imaginable, but none as internally consistent as Keitel's. Then came the line that defined his psychology. To obey was my fate. That phrase would reappear in his last words almost verbatim, and it would chill you to the bone. That single sentence carried the weight of his entire career and his failure. It transformed obedience from a choice into destiny. With it, Keitel suggested that moral agency was never his to claim. The statement went on to invoke the chaos of 1945, the collapse of command, the confusion of orders. He portrayed himself as a soldier caught between surrender and annihilation, insisting he'd acted for what he believed was Germany's survival. "I ask not for mercy," he said, "but for understanding." The judges gave him neither. In those words, you can hear the pattern, the same precision that carried through his trial, the same refusal to personalize guilt. To Keitel, duty and destiny were indistinguishable. That is what makes his final spoken words, moments before death, so shocking. Because they didn't depart from this mindset. They completed it. They were the purest expression of the belief he voiced here, stripped of courtroom language and reduced to a single unforgettable cry. It's time to reveal everything because you're about to hear what Wilhelm Keitel said before he died. And those words will haunt you for the rest of your life. The moment on the scaffold, October 16th, 1946. The execution chamber was freezing. The gallows creaked. Wilhelm Keitel entered, head up, shoulders back. This was the moment. Everything had led here. The first of the condemned was already dead, and the hangman's team moved with silent efficiency. When Wilhelm Keitel entered the chamber, those present noted how straight he stood, as if walking to a briefing, not an execution. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain prison suit, but his posture hadn't changed. Even here, hierarchy lingered. 12 witnesses, 4 guards, 1 hangman. They'd all seen death before, but what Wilhelm Keitel was about to say would make them question everything they thought they knew about loyalty. Colonel Andres, the prison commandant, asked his name. "Wilhelm Keitel," he replied, voice firm. Then came the pause. 3 seconds. The longest 3 seconds in Nuremberg. He turned to the priest and exchanged a quiet word of prayer. Seconds later, the noose was placed around his neck. The room held its breath. For a moment, it seemed Keitel might remain silent, a soldier submitting to order, even in death. Then he spoke. His words weren't a plea or apology. They were something that cut straight through the air. "I call on Almighty God to be merciful to the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their deaths for the fatherland before me. I now follow my sons, all for Germany." The witnesses froze. One reporter dropped his pen. This wasn't remorse. This was defiance dressed as patriotism. Not, "I'm sorry," not "forgive me." He invoked God and Germany in the same breath, and linked his death to millions of soldiers who died before him. That closing line, "all for Germany," was the same phrase inscribed on Nazi ceremonial daggers and used in military oaths. To those who heard it, it sounded less like surrender than continuity. The last affirmation of the ideology that had condemned him. Then came silence. The hangman pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened, and with it, one of the final voices of the Third Reich was gone. The witnesses filed out in silence, but Wilhelm Keitel's last words stayed in that room. And they've never left, because what he said wasn't just about him. It was about every soldier who ever followed orders without question. And that's what makes them unforgettable. Even stripped of rank, standing under the rope, Wilhelm Keitel still could not separate duty from destiny. His last breath confirmed the very mindset that destroyed him. Within days, those words would spark a debate that still hasn't ended. The echo that wouldn't fade. The trapdoor falls. Wilhelm Keitel is dead. The witnesses think it's over. They're wrong. Within 6 hours, his last words are in newspapers across 3 continents. Within 6 days, they're being debated in Parliament. They didn't die with him. They multiplied. The line "All for Germany" began to appear almost immediately in reports, memoirs, and newspapers across Europe and America. The words resonated, not as confession, but as continuity, as if even in death, Keitel had refused to renounce the cause that had condemned him. For the Allied prosecutors, who had spent months dismantling the Nazi command system, those final words confirmed everything they had argued in court, that the mindset of obedience had survived the verdict. One of them later wrote, "Even on the scaffold, he remained the perfect staff officer, loyal to his superiors to the end." German historians, reflecting decades later, took a more cautious view. Some argued that Keitel's invocation of God in Germany was not deliberate defiance, but the conditioned reflex of a man who had never lived outside the military code. The distinction mattered not because it excused him, but because it exposed how deeply the Nazi structure had replaced conscience with command. Others saw something more dangerous in the phrase. It allowed denial to masquerade as honor. Think about that power. By linking his death to the sacrifice of 2 million German soldiers, Keitel blurred the moral boundary between those who fought and those who ordered atrocities. The statement merged guilt and heroism into one sentiment, a final act of rhetorical camouflage. And that's exactly what made it so dangerous, because it permitted others to do the same. After the war, many senior officers, men like Albert Kessler, Erich von Manstein, and others, used similar language to frame their service as patriotic rather than criminal. They portrayed themselves as soldiers doing their duty for Germany, not as enablers of Nazi aggression or genocide. Keitel's "All for Germany" set the tone. Loyalty and sacrifice over accountability. 70 years later, his last words still appear in military ethics courses. Why? Because they expose the darkest truth about obedience. You can feel why those words still unsettle people. As one observer at Nuremberg wrote years later, "He died as he lived, obeying an idea." Soldiers around the world shivered as the tale of Keitel's shocking last words spread. How could they presume to be fighting for the greater good if one of Hitler's most loyal generals had believed he was on the right side of history? Where does the line between obedience and conscience lay? Could Keitel's mind really justify the atrocities he had signed off in the name of loyalty? The debate exploded. Was it a farewell, a justification, a warning? The answer matters because 60 million people died in that war. And Wilhelm Keitel's last words suggested he'd do it all again. And that's why so many years later, they still chill you to the bone. The aftermath. 6 a.m., the executions end. By noon, the gallows are gone. By sunset, the bodies are ash. The Allies wanted no martyrs, no shrines, no symbols. They got their wish, except for one thing they couldn't erase: Wilhelm Keitel's last words. For some, his words confirmed what the tribunal had already proven, that Keitel had never broken free from the ideology he served. Even at the brink of death, he still cast himself as a soldier following destiny rather than a man confronting responsibility. His phrase invoking both God and Germany seemed to wrap faith and nationalism into a single breath. To others, that was precisely what made it so dangerous. In Germany, as the country began the long process of denazification, Keitel's execution was reported without ceremony. There were no official tributes, no state mourning. But quietly, among those who had served under him, some felt uneasy. They saw his composure, his invocation of 2 million dead soldiers, and heard in it not pride, but a desperate attempt to find meaning in defeat. Historians remain divided. Some interpret his words as the product of indoctrination so complete that conscience had no space to act. Others see them as a calculated performance, a way to preserve dignity before history stripped it away. Either way, they remain chilling, because they show how ideology can survive even when the man who held it does not. Wilhelm Keitel's last words reflect an entire generation's failure to separate loyalty from conscience. But they also carved his legacy into history, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a warning. This is what happens when duty replaces conscience, when orders replace morality, when all for Germany means nothing for humanity. Did Wilhelm Keitel's last words expose a man too broken by ideology to see the truth? Or did they expose the terrifying reality that he saw it perfectly and still chose obedience?